Greetings. This lecture is on workflows, job analysis, and job design. And our first slide is an example of that human resource management system, which we try to expose for every single lecture. And what we're talking about now is part of what happens in that planning phase, the idea of creating the flow of work, in terms of planning, forecasting, managing the job designs and the job analysis, and how work flows from one individual to the other. Part of workflow is really tied very tightly with the way we design jobs, so that if we want work to flow in a particular way in the organization, what we then do is design the jobs to maximize that flow so that we can minimize expenses and minimize barriers to getting the work done. So our next slide is about designing the organization itself. And obviously there's lots of different ways that we can design organizations, but one primary way we can do that is either as a bureaucratic organization or something very flat, or what we call a boundaryless organization. And the next couple of slides sort of take us through that. A bureaucratic organization is very much layered with lots of accountabilities, and it goes from the highest level in the organization down to the lowest level with multiple layers of management and middle management and upper management in between. These tend to be set up this way because jobs are very narrowly defined. People have a very small amount of responsibility for certain types of things. And we want people to be accountable for certain things with certain people. There is what we call a functional division of labor, so that I do one thing and you do something else and somebody else does something else. There's no flow, easy flow between people and from top to bottom in the company. Even though it is a top-down command and control sort of structure, information doesn't flow very quickly or very easily. It usually has to snake itself through lots of layers. And we use the term bureaucracy because the word bureaucracy is synonymous nowadays with this concept of having lots of red tape and too much effort to have to get a simple decision done. This was designed years ago because we needed accountabilities for people, and as organizations started to grow and we went from the small mom and pop store to the Industrial Revolution, this command and control structure made sense because we could take people out of jobs and plug somebody else in, and the job would be very clear. It had a very easy job description. People could learn it, and anybody could do any of those jobs. You could take one person out and plug somebody else in, and it worked really well. This also is a kind of structure that works well in a very stable and predictable environment, because in this kind of environment, you can't make decisions fast. But a bureaucratic organization is just better when it's more stable. Unfortunately, in this day and age, stable environments don't exist. Most environments are fairly changing. So this kind of structure works well in that stable environment when there's no competition, when there's no worry that there may be it may be slow to be able to make a decision. It is not a common structure anymore. We see it to some extent in the military and some government organizations because there are, again, greater bureaucracies and accountabilities that we expect from those kinds of organizations. We want transparency, we want checks and balances. And so a bureaucratic structure is better for those sorts of things. But by and large, most organizations don't look bureaucratic anymore because we realize we can't compete in the marketplace when we're very bureaucratic. Most of the time what you'll see is a flat organization. And what basically happened in the 80s is that we took these very tall bureaucratic organizations and we took out middle management and we squished the organization down so that instead of each manager having 2 or 3 or 5 direct reports, they now have 10 or 15 or 20. We have fewer managers. We have our top management team is still solid, But instead of only having 2 or 3 or 5 direct reports, they now have 10 or 20. So that makes the organization flatter and wider as opposed to taller and thinner, as you would see with the bureaucracy. And the goal of this flatter organization is it doesn't take a long time to be able to make decisions, that things don't get caught up in this horrible processes, that we can have something come to an associate and it can move up 2 layers or 3 layers to get to the executive, and the executive can make a decision, and then that information can filter back down to the executive, so that stuff can happen pretty rapidly. And we like flatter structures because they're more adaptable and more flexible in this day and age and in this environment. To add to even more flexibility, we have what we call a boundaryless organization. And a boundaryless organization is basically a number of organizations that come together to have sort of a loose relationship. And usually it's multiple flat organizations coming together and trying to do work together in a way that they can share information or share supplies, or have complementary technologies that help to produce a product or service for someone. And so we saw a boundaryless organization years ago when Apple and IBM did a joint venture to make sure that the Apple computer could communicate with the IBM computer, IBM-based computer, which of course is now really just Windows-based, it's Microsoft-based. But the Microsoft platform now can talk to the Apple platform and back and forth, whereas 20 years ago that wasn't a possibility. So at that point in time, they decided to work together as a boundaryless organization, and they shared information so that the computers could now talk to each other in a way that they weren't able to do before. Okay, so our next slide, after we talk about boundaryless organizations and other kinds of structures, we want to talk about workflow analysis. And the goal of workflow analysis is to see how does work flow through the organization. Does it make sense for it to be bureaucratically structured, or should it be more of a flat organization, or does it really benefit us to have more of a boundaryless organization where we have these loose relationships with other companies so that we can sort of support each other in that manner. So a workflow analysis figures out how to create the most value for the company based on the way work flows through the business from beginning to end. So from design opportunities down to implementation and delivery to the customer, whether that's a product or service, how should work flow through the company? And the goal here is to streamline things, to make it more efficient, not just effective, but more efficient, so that when we can get things from beginning to end, we have the least amount of steps and the most amount of value added to the product or service. And one thing that we call this, another word for trying to keep this as simple as possible, is business process reengineering. And that's one way of reimagining how the work gets done in the company. And we do it in such a way, again, to add the value, to keep effectiveness high and efficiency also as high as possible. Managing production and quality all at the same time, and yet getting the work output done as much as we can. In terms of the group process, now we talked about how we can do workflow analysis at the organizational level. We also can do it at the team-based level. And so when we are at the sort of unit or team-based level, we want to put people together in teams that have complementary skills for a particular purpose. So a team-based environment or a team-based structure, its primary goal is to have people work together as a cohesive unit to create a product or service, or one part of a product or service. Teams are essential when we're working in a flat or a boundaryless organization, because a lot of the work is done at the team-based level. It's where the directives go to, it's where the accountabilities are set, and that's how the work gets done in these smaller units where there's a lot more responsibility towards each other. And we have lots of different types of teams. We can have a self-managed team where people on the team
all have unique skills, but they're also cross-trained, so they can always substitute for each other where need be. It also is good because it minimizes boredom and enables people to have a broader set of skills, so that helps them to grow personally. We can have problem-solving teams, whereas if we encounter a problem in production or service or in a customer or a market, the problem-solving team comes together and they work through the problems and the issues and they come up with some solutions. We can also have what we call a special purpose team or a task force, and the job of that task force is to come up with a new creative idea or to solve a particularly complex problem or issue, one that maybe doesn't fit within just creating a product or service for somebody, but it might be a larger issue like why do we have so much absenteeism, or why do we have so many accidents, or how can we make a product and improve on our product line in a way that might meet the needs of our customers better. We can also have virtual teams where we have people working essentially on a team-based project, but they might be at various locations. And typically virtual teams work in the area of project management or software development or things like that, where they can work on individual elements at different locations, and then the work is compiled at one location in order to be able to meet the organization's needs. So we have all different kinds of teams, and the teams have to be designed in a way that makes sense based on the way we want the work to flow through the organization. We also want our workforces to be flexible. One of the reasons why we've gotten away from these long and tall and thin bureaucratic structures is because they don't adapt and they don't change and they don't make ends meet. So the flexible workforces go hand in hand with a flatter or boundaryless type of organizational structure. And so the way the flexible workforce works is we have a set of core workers who work on particular areas, do particular things, and they are the full-time employees that have the competitive advantage that the organization wants. And then they bring in contingent workers depending on what their needs are. And contingent workers are basically people who come in and they work on a project, or they work for a period of time, or they have a particular aspect of a project that they may work on, but they are not part of the heart and soul and the part and parcel of that organization. They are on the outskirts. They kind of come and go. They meet the organization's needs, and then they disband and move on. So you can have temps. You can have part-time workers who kind of come in a couple hours a week and sort of fill the gaps where work needs to be done. You can have outsourcing and subcontracting that's done so that you can have an outsourced organization take care of a small part of your business. You can have contract workers who basically come in, do a project for you as a consultant, and then they leave. And you can also have things like college interns. And as you'll see when we talk about recruiting, these contingent workers are a way for us to meet workplace demands without necessarily having to hire someone on a full-time basis with all of the costs that go along with that. So that's the nice thing about having these contingent workers, is that they are temporary, they're part-time. There's no guarantee of long-term employment with them, and we use them as we need to, and then we disband them when we don't. The advantages of outsourcing, because there's advantages and disadvantages to using any of those kinds of tools, but outsourcing is obviously one of the more common ones. One of the advantages of that is that you can get a subset of high-quality people to do a project very quickly. And they may not come to work for you permanently, but they may be working for this subcontractor where they make a certain amount of money that you might not be able to afford to pay for a full-time basis. But you're willing to pay for that skill on a one-time basis or even a short-term basis. The other thing that's good with outsourcing is that you have economies of scale. And so if you're outsourcing certain work, you are keeping the stuff that you do really well inside, and you can save money doing that. And the things that you're not very good at or that you're willing to spend more money for, you can only pay for it as you need it. And also the good thing about outsourcing is that you're not always bringing in new people to the company, and you don't have this sort of revolving door of skills and people. You're preserving your company culture, and you're only sending work out as need be. The disadvantages of these is that a lot of times you will lose the control of a lot of the work because someone else in another organization is responsible for making sure that work gets done. So you don't have as much control over that. Another aspect, if you're looking to develop your internal competencies and your skills, outsourcing doesn't allow you to do that because those skills stay with the outsourced company and they don't come into you and your business to help you to do that. Another thing that we might see when we're thinking about workflows is dealing with flexible schedules. And we talked a little bit about flexible schedules when we were addressing the different trends in the workplace, how millennials like more flexibility, and traditionalists and baby boomers like that very sort of standard 9-to-5 kind of job. And what we're seeing is flexible schedules can work really well in certain environments. You can have flex time, which basically means everybody works from, say, 10 to 4, and then people can either come in early or stay later depending on what their needs are. And there may be some people that prefer to come in later and stay later, and other people that prefer to come in early and leave early. It sort of depends on what their family needs are, or whether they work better in the morning or they work better in the evening. Some people just don't function at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. in the morning. I know I don't like to, but other people don't like to stay later in the day because they feel like they've got personal commitments and family obligations that they don't want to stay until 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock at night sometimes. Another aspect of flexible scheduling is those compressed work weeks where, again, as it says there, 4 10-hour days, that's 40 hours, or they work 4 12-hour shifts, that's 48 hours, and that gives you the 5th day off. Nurses tend to work schedules like that, where they have 3 days on, 2 days off, or something along that line. You can also do telecommuting, where you work partly or almost fully from home, and then you do your work from your home office, and then you telecommute back and forth. And then you can also have what we call a mobile workplace, where your workplace may be your car. You can have it set up with internet and iPads and things like that to enable you to do the work that you need to do. So all these different structures are basically a way to help us design the way work flows through the company. We design our company to help us make the most important decisions for the business. And so if part of our work and part of the decisions that we need to make is around a certain kind of product or service, we design the company to maximize our ability to make good decisions around that product or service. Within that, once we've thought about what the job design is going to look like and how we want things to flow, we then have to break it down to decide what should be in the jobs, the job analysis, if you will. How do we know what aspects should be in the job, what's important in that job now that we've redesigned things? How do we create that job description so that we are able to know what's expected of us, so that we can get evaluated, we can learn our job well, we can get paid appropriately, we can get trained on the skills that we need, and we know basically what skills we need to use to hire somebody. So job analysis is how we gather that information about the characteristics of the job. And there's a lot of different options about who should do a job analysis, but largely the human resource management function or an external consultant should be the people who are involved in doing job analysis. An HR professional is more objective. They are in a position where they don't have any sort of loyalties to the employee or to the supervisor, but they can more objectively look at the way work is flowing in the company and make recommendations on the best way to design a particular job and create and what the skills are that are needed to be able to do that job. They can assess them and diagnose them much better. Consultants can also be good, particularly if they have an enormous amount of skill and experience doing job analysis. We can bring in external consultants to come in and do that sort of work for us. Supervisors are probably not the best people to do job descriptions, and the reason why we don't want the supervisors to do it is because they're biased. They have a certain idea about what they think should be done and how work should be done. And the bottom line is, if the employee has a different opinion on that, that can create a lot of conflict in the organization. And so our goal is to not necessarily have our HR professional do the we want our HR professional or our consultant to do the analysis, not our supervisor, because our supervisor is going to struggle with that sort of stuff. Once we've determined who is going to do the job analysis, we have to figure out how we're going to get the data to do the analysis. And there are a lot of different sources for the analysis. Number one, the job analyst, him or herself. They go out, they observe things, they're talking to people, they're walking around the organization, they're assessing all the documents, they are bringing their perspective or bias, depending on how you want to look at it, to the situation. Employees also who are doing the job are people that you would want to consider for sources of data, because these individuals have access to the job and what happens to every day. They know the best way to do things, the way that they've been trained to do things, and they have a different perspective that other people don't have because they do it every day. The supervisor, on the other hand, has a very different perspective. The supervisor maybe doesn't do the work every day, but they have a better sense of why the work needs to be done and where it fits into the bigger picture in the organization. They may also be better at sort of thinking about what the strategic reason is to do the work the way that they want it done. Even if the employee says, oh, I don't want to do this, I don't like this, the supervisor brings to the table a very different perspective in that they maybe understand the strategy and the major purposes behind doing something in a certain way. So there's always a tension then between the employee's perspective and the supervisor's perspective about what should be done, how it should be done, and when it should be done. And the purpose of the job analyst is to really work on how they can balance the demands of both, or understand the politics of both, and still come up with a good job analysis that's good for the organization. There's a multitude of different ways that we can collect data. Your textbook has a lot of different methods outlined, but the highlights, the bigger ones that you want to think about are interviewing people, questionnaires, particularly position analysis questionnaires. The analyst can observe people and they can watch processes and they can come up with opinions based on that. You can also go into secondary records, and we'll talk in class about some of what those secondary records are. Online sources such as ONET. ONET is a bunch of generic job descriptions for every job, and what I'll do when we get into class is I will demonstrate to you what some of those job descriptions, those generic job descriptions look like. So, what information do we collect? We collect two different types of information, job-related data and employee-related data. The job-related data tells us what kind of tasks will be done on the job. The employee-related data are getting at the characteristics of the individual and the types of things that they need to do, and so the types of skills that they need to have to be able to do that job. So from the job-related data perspective, we're looking at the content and the context factors. We're looking at how many hours a day do they work, where do they work, those kinds of things. And then the work characteristics, the specific tasks that people do on the job. The employee-related data are looking at what characteristics should somebody have. What do they need to be minimally qualified to be able to do this job? Who do they talk to? How many subordinates do they have? How often do they have to work with peers and teams and their boss and subordinates and those kinds of things? So all of this information is collected on the tasks and what's expected. And then from there, we create two things. We create the job description, which is a description of the actual tasks of the jobs, things that people do every day, and the job specification, which is what are the requirements that have to be there in order for someone to be able to do the job. Do they need a high school diploma? Do they need a college degree? Do they need a college degree in marketing? Do they need a college degree in sociology or social work? Do they have to know how to use a cash register or be able to work with customers? All of these things are important specifications, and we'll talk about different kinds of job descriptions that we can create. Why are job descriptions important? Well, first of all, it helps us to decide when we're creating a recruiting ad to know what kind of characteristics we are looking for when we go out to recruit people. So we might say in our recruiting ad, must have 10 years experience, must have these kinds of skills, must have this sort of education, and that enables us then to attract a higher qualified applicant pool to come to the organization. Then we have selection and promotion. The job description helps us to decide what kind of selection tests we're going to use to select the right kind of people for the job. So if people are doing a particular job and they need a particular skill, we want to then have a test that measures that skill. And we'll talk about some challenges in picking and matching selection tests and skills when we get into the selections aspect of the class. We want to know, we want to have a job description in order for us to be able to determine training and development needs. Training needs are about what types of skills people need to be able to do the job. And we go to the job description to know they need to know these certain things. These are the skills we need them to have to do this job. And then we can train them to make sure that they are able to continue to do that job down the line. In terms of performance appraisals, we are evaluating people based on how well they do their job. And the only way we know what is entailed in the job is to actually have the performance appraisal that says they must do these kinds of things at this level of quality for this amount of time, and they spend this amount of time doing this job, this amount of time doing this task, and it all breaks itself down that way. Lastly, when we evaluate how much a job should be paid in terms of the base pay, we need to know what the job description says. And then also as we decide on pay for performance, that's tying in together performance appraisal and what the job description says to make sure that people are performing at the highest level possible in order to get the raises that they would get in terms of pay for performance. So we have to know what are the most important, what we call compensable factors in the job to know what each job is valued at in terms of determining base pay. And then we also need to know how well someone performs against the job description in order to do pay for performance. So the next slide talks about the impact of the job, the biggest problems with job descriptions. And some of the biggest problems obviously are related to the law. We don't want job descriptions that are written in such a way that discriminate based on Title VII or the Americans with Disabilities Act or Age Discrimination and Employment Act. So we can't say this job is for women only or African Americans only or the disabled, not the disabled or not older people. You know, we can't build in discrimination unless it's a bona fide occupational qualification, obviously. So we want to be really careful as we write these job descriptions. A lot of times, though, we either write them very vaguely or we write them in such a way that really is so strict and so tight that it limits people's abilities to do different jobs. And so because of these two extremes, you know, people are usually at one extreme or the other. They're either too vague and too light in terms of what it expects of people, or on the other extreme, they're so tight and so detailed that they're very limiting, so that if someone, you know, gets a request to do something, they could turn around and go, no, sorry, it's not in my job description, I'm not going to do that. Whereas if it's really vague, you might end up in a situation where more than one person is doing a particular job and you've got redundancies, which is not very efficient. in the organization. The last big issue with job descriptions is that they're not always updated regularly. And in fact, we should be looking at them annually and probably do a rewrite every 2 years, a major rewrite every 2 years. I mean, that would be the best situation possible. What are the best steps in terms of doing an effective job analysis? Well, number one, the job analyst has to go out and probably gather some preliminary information about the job. They need to look at where the person works, look at their desk, look at the flows of work, look at the kind of reports and stuff that they do. They do a workplace tour, they gather information on that tour, they learn about the whole overall work process in the company. How does work flow through the business? How do we decide what's the best way to arrange things? Then we collect the data. We have to figure out how much we want, who's going to give us the information, and how we're actually going to collect it. We then gather all that up, do another tour, and then what we try to do is look for commonalities, look for patterns, consolidate that information, and write your first draft, at least, of your job description. We then go back to our job incumbents, who are the employees, and the supervisors, and their supervisors, to see whether or not this job description accurately reflects what the job entails. And you may have to do some balancing and negotiating between the job incumbent and the supervisor in order to get a job description that both parties are happy with. So it can be somewhat of a political process to learn how to do this well, and that's one of the reasons why we don't want new employees doing job analysis, because they really need to understand power, politics, organizational power bases and political activities and those kinds of things. Someone who's new and green and who's never worked before, it's the last thing you want to do, is have somebody who's new and green doing that kind of job. Okay, so that ends our discussion on the job analysis side as well as the workflow side. What we're going to get into now specifically is job design, and we have a few slides on job design. Basically what we're doing with job design is we are looking at these job descriptions and what we want work to be like, and we're looking at the workflows and the way we want work to flow through the company, and we're creating the structure of the jobs so that it matches organizational goals and the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the employees. And so we want to create a situation where we use the way we design jobs to improve motivation and to also facilitate the ability to do particular work. Typically, we have 4 approaches to the way that we do work: job simplification, job enlargement, job rotation, and job enrichment. And basically, job simplification is we keep everything really simple and straightforward. Tasks are very specialized, standardized, and simplified so that there is no doubt, no question about how to do the work. Job enlargement is where you basically are doing a lot of simple tasks, except that the problem with doing a lot of simple tasks and the boredom that comes with it is now you have a lot of tasks that bored you as opposed to one task that bores you. Lastly, we have job rotation, which is where we have simple jobs, but they're rotated. So at least we're removing some of the boredom, but people don't necessarily get paid more for expanding their skills. And the jobs are still fairly simple, so they may not be very enriching to the individual. The last thing that we should be doing is really creating enriched jobs for people, because we know that autonomy, mastery, and purpose are the things that really contribute to greater motivation and the ability to do a lot of very interesting things on the job. And when we talk about the job characteristics model from our motivation theories, this is tightly aligned with job enrichment.